Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your Sweep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians. The most important ones are the Russian advances through gaining deeper control within Pokrovsk in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, gaining control over additional parts of the river line and crossing over the river line into the Novopavlivka region. Continuous advances along the first line of defense, as well as the expansion of their zone of control along the border area, gaining control over the town of Oderatne. The Russians also managed to secure their positions within the settlement along the border area in the northern section of the front line. Starting out in the south, the Russians continued offensive operations to the northwest of Ulhivsk. Following the capture of the settlement and Novopavlivka, the Russians are now storming and connecting their forces along the fortified positions just south of the settlement. The Russians are storming these final three fortified positions, getting control over an additional one, leaving just the three east of the Encirclement river line under Ukrainian control, following which they can push in the direction of Novopavlivka and the river line here to the west in the Encirclement river line direction. We see that there is a river line to the north and a river line to the south that gives the Russians a flank that is protected both in the northern and southern directions, allowing them to concentrate their forces in either of these directions. The Russians will likely align the front line along with the river line, push up in the northern direction and concentrate their forces in the direction of Novopavlivka to gain control over the settlement along the crossing along the main road and cross over several positions along the river line, as we are currently still seeing that the river lines are depleted and the weather conditions remain sunny despite the end of summer. Until the rainy season begins, these river lines will not be filled up again, and this will allow the Russians to continuously cross over these river lines with ease, which will enable the Russian offensive operations through the river line along the first line of defense, and also to connect with their forces by gaining control over Novopavlivka from the south, will secure the southern flank of the Russian forces along the second line of defense, where Russians continue offensive operations along the defensive line to the rear of Stepova, gaining control over which will allow them to gain control over Kalinivske, and then continue along the second line of defense through Verbove, and then onwards towards Vishneve. However, the Russians would also need to gain control over the southern bank of the Vovchi river line as they continue in the western direction to prevent the Ukrainian counterattacking and cutting off the Russian positions in the area. That is why the Russians are interested in gaining full control over the river line. Once they reach it, to secure the river line will allow the Russians to have control over the southern flank and strengthen their positions along the second line of defense as well as the first line of defense. However, without control over the northern flank of the second line of defense, the positions will never be properly secured, although with control of the southern flank, they can prevent encirclements. The Russians continue their offensive operations along the first and second lines of defense, as well as in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, where they've managed to gain control over the forest lines and forest patches along the Vovchi river line, and also to cross over into the town of Ivanivka here in the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians now have three footholds within the Dnipropetrovsk region north of the Vovchi river line, both in the direction of Dashne to the east, Filia to the center, and Ivanivka to the west. All of these three are on the southern flank of Novopavlivka and are cutting off some of the supply lines, either to the frontline positions or to Novopavlivka. This means that the only supply line directly connected to Novopavlivka is the northern one connected through Meshova. The Russians now will likely aim to gain control over the flanks of Novopavlivka, pushed through to the southern parts and eastern parts, and expand the zone of control in between the fortified positions to the west and the highway to the east to gain fire control over the highway, which will operationally encircle the town. We see that the surrounding areas is clearly wide open. There's no significant fortifications, there's no high ground positions, it's just flatlands, fields, and forest lines. All of this is easily covered by vehicles, tanks, and drones, which have a long range and can gain fire control over the highway from a far distance with a drone coverage. This means the Russians will likely push for settlements such as Fedorivske and Terasivka if they gain control over Ivanivka, which will then allow them to use these settlements as an outpost for fire control over the highway, potentially push through towards Chuhuyeva in the southern flank of Myshova and northern flank of Novopavlivka to physically cut off the highway and leave just some of these defensive lines along the Selena River here to the northeast, connecting and resupplying their forces. But again, the Ukrainian forces would be severely depleted of their logistical lines, which limits their defensive capabilities. The Russians gain control of Novopavlivka. The road will be open directly to Myshova in the north, as there are hardly any resistance by Ukrainian forces through geographical or physical barriers that they have available, with no major settlements, only open fields and forest lines in between the two locations. In the direction of Pokrovsk, the Russians have significantly expanded their zone of control in the western parts of the city. The Russians managed to gain control over the TO406 highway from the northern flank of the settlement just south in the direction of Leontovichi. From this, the Russians have secured an additional road to supply the forces in the western parts of the city. The Russians are here also looking to gain control over the remaining parts along the defensive line here just outside of the city and alongside the railway to connect with the forces. This is to secure the western flank from the 246 highway, gaining a wider control over the area. If the Russians are able to secure the southern parts of Pokrovsk through the southern flank of the railway area, the entirety of it in Shakhtarsk district, the residential area, the apartment complex areas, and the settlements here all the way to Novopavlivka, the Russians will be able to properly resupply the forces through the Shevchenko highway and connect their forces with the forces in the direction of Adashna and Kotlina along the TO406 highway. This will make the roads here along the southern flank of Pokrovsk well connected for the Russian forces, strengthen their offensive capabilities in the western, northern, and eastern directions. At the same time, if the Russians are able to continue pushing further north along the E50 highway and gain control over the industrial area here in the northwestern outskirts of Pokrovsk, they will have operationally encircled the city, leaving just some off-road roads along the fields to resupply the forces, as the Reshine road would be cut off into the city itself. However, there is this secondary road that connects to the highway south of Rodinske, which means the Russians would have to gain control over Rodinske itself to physically cut off the supplies going in and out of Pokrovsk, but they will still have fire control over the road by gaining control over the industrial area, which will allow them to look out towards the supply lines to the north. This means the Russian objective right now is to gain control over the industrial area along the E50 highway, the Shakhtarsk district in the southeast of Pokrovsk, and Rodinske on the northern flank, which will allow them to operationally and physically encircle the Ukrainian forces remaining within Pokrovsk itself and the entirety of Mirnorod and the surrounding settlements. We're seeing that the Russian pressure on the eastern flank has increased, despite the Ukrainian counterattacks, especially centered around the northern flank of Pokrovsk. However, the Russians are also strengthening offensive operations within Pokrovsk itself, where the Ukrainian defense is lacking, as they doubled down on the defense of the northeastern flank. If the Ukrainians used too many of their forces in this counterattack and failed to achieve success with it, which is cutting off the Russian positions west of the river line, which will free up the supply lines to the north, then the Russian forces will have sped up their offensive operations to gain control over Pokrovsk and completely gain control over it at a faster pace due to the failure of the Ukrainian offensive. Therefore, the Ukrainians either have to redirect their forces to defend the city or to double down and actually succeed with their counterattack. Otherwise, the longer it takes and the longer they go without cutting off the northern flank, the easier it will be for the Russians to gain control over Pokrovsk and Mirnorod, while also inflicting casualties on the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are already supplying not just a counterattack here in the Mirnorod direction, but also the entire defense of Mirnorod and Pokrovsk through the supply lines along the E50 highway, where the Russians can soon gain fire control of it, as well as the Prushina road here through the northern flank, both of which the Russians are within close proximity to and can soon gain fire control of, which means the Russians are just a few steps away from operationally encircling both of these cities and the Ukrainian counterattack in the south of the northern flank. Moving up north in the direction of the Kharkiv region, the Russians have managed to gain full control over Odradnik, continuing the offensive operations along the border area. There are two settlements remaining, Pokrovsk and Novopavlivka, that prevents the connection of the Russian forces along the border area with the forces along the Osk River line. Gaining control of these settlements are the next step of the Russian forces to gain control over a wide section of the border between the Kharkiv and Belgorod region. For now, it may remain as a buffer zone between the two regions, where the Russians will look to gain control over the entire area. But once the Russians gain control over Vovchansk and Kupiansk, it can expand into a larger operation to connect their forces between the different sides and expand offensive operations here in the northern parts of the Kharkiv region to launch offensive operations further south. In the northwestern parts of the Sumy region, the Russians have managed to secure Vasilivka following the Ukrainian counterattacks that took place some weeks ago. The Russians have now secured the town yet again, which allows them to secure the positions in the vicinity of Tsetkino by preventing the Ukrainians from counterattacking and cutting off the supply lines, which left Tsetkino in a difficult position the last time the Ukrainians launched an offensive here into the Kursk region. Now, with control over Vasilivka, they were able to secure these supply lines and reorganize the defense of the town. As we can see, the Russians continue offensive operations all throughout the front line, where their main tactics continue as it has been since the capture of Avdiivka in late 2023, early 2024, where they switched their tactics to completely rely on these operational encirclements, cutting off the supplies, and then heavily bombarding the positions with FAB bombs, which will force a withdrawal, and during this withdrawal they'll be under fire control of Russian forces, which significantly increases the casualties of the defenders. This sort of tactic removes the majority of the difficulties with the siege, while limiting your own casualties, because you don't really storm to gain control of it like the Wagner did in Bakhmut, where they had to push through street from street, through building and building, all the way to gain full control of the entirety of the city. Instead, the Russians are working on designated points within different cities to gain control over important supply hubs and supply lines, which allows them to then switch the situation around to put the Ukrainians in a difficult position, starving them out and pushing them out with heavy firepower. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.